So we have with us this afternoon now, Alexandra Loubeau, who got a master's and PhD in acoustics from Penn State, and she came from there right to NASA Langley, where she's been working as a co-lead for the sonic boom community testing research on the X59. And I asked her to give this talk because so many of you folks aren't familiar with psychoacoustic testing, and you'll get a little bit of a background, hopefully, with this. She's going to be talking about the X59 test and the way they do the supersonic tests, the surveys of the public's reaction, and how they evaluate all of this. So I am going to please welcome Alexandra while I fiddle to try to bring up her presentation.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks for the introduction and invitation. I'm happy to be here. All right. Well, thanks so much. I appreciate Dan inviting me here today. I've had the pleasure of being in the same branch as Dan and sharing tea time and stories. So this is a fun activity to talk to more of you. So my name is Alexandra Loubeau. I'm in the structural acoustics branch. I've been at NASA for a little over 13 years now. First, I'll just start with acknowledging the Commercial Supersonic Technology Project and its previous names. It had different names like supersonics or high speed, but it's been kind of a long-lasting research project and looking at sonic booms and the effects on people. And so today, our little subgroup is called Community Test Planning and Execution. There are a lot of folks from across NASA at Langley, but also mostly at NASA Armstrong on this sub-team. And then we also have a lot of partners in industry, other government organizations and universities. And so they're all part of the larger NASA team. And so some of the things I'll be talking about today are work that we've done through a lot of these partnerships and teams. So our vision for commercial supersonic flight is really, there's been continued interest in civil supersonic aircraft, and in the last 5 or so years, there's been even greater interest. That's evidenced by several companies that are actually coming out with plans for new supersonic civil aircraft, even though today there actually aren't standards for landing and takeoff noise or being able to fly over land supersonic, because they're actually restricted due to the unacceptable sonic boom sound. And this dates back to tests that were done in the 60s on people's reactions to sonic booms. And so that's really the biggest barrier to this vision of being able to change civil flight. And so the vision for us is to have in the future supersonic aircraft that will be efficient, affordable, environmentally responsible, and quiet. And so NASA's role is really to develop the data in order to enable new standards to be drawn up, so that instead of a restriction, there would be a rule that says you can fly as long as your aircraft produces a sound that's below a certain level. And so these new standards are needed. That's really the biggest challenge, is the sound. There are obviously other things having to do with efficiency of the aircraft and emissions and that sort of thing, but the noise is really the biggest barrier that we need to get past first. So as of now, there's really no relevant community test data out there that can be used to draw up these standards. And so that's why NASA has put together what we call our critical commitment, and that's to support this development of the new standards. And the idea is to collect data from communities across the US, a large diverse population, on their perception of sonic boom sounds from a low boom shaped aircraft, such as what you see here, just a concept drawing of what NASA's developing, the X-59 aircraft. And then what I've said at the bottom is really, it's a reminder that this standard is not just for the US, it actually is for international. And so we do need to kind of talk this through the planning and everything with the international folks and make sure that they are on board so that a standard would be possible. Okay. And so here's maybe a slightly newer concept version drawing of the X-59, which NASA is developing. It's a new X-plane. It's being built by Lockheed Martin Skunk Works. It's about 100 feet long. It has what you might consider kind of the typical shape of a supersonic aircraft, the long pointy nose, the swept back wings, and that's all to give you a better low boom, quieter sound. It will first fly next year, and then in 2023, we plan to actually fly it supersonic and take a lot of measurements to validate that the design that we thought was supposed to give us a low boom really does give us a low boom at the ground at the levels that we expect. And then we will, starting the following year in 2024, start to fly it over communities in the US to survey the public. So today I'm going to give you a quick sonic boom overview. Then I'll get into more the fun stuff that Dan mentioned, psychoacoustics research, talk a bit about what we've done in the lab with sonic boom simulators, some of the studies we've done, and some of the community studies that we've started doing. So actually working out in the field, and to talk a bit more about the X-59 aircraft itself and where we are today in our preparations for community testing. So I'll start with this sonic boom overview. I imagine that several of you have heard Dom Maglieri talk about sonic boom research. I know he gives a very good talk on this. So this will be kind of a refresher course, if you will. It'll be quite short. So the supersonic flight, it means your aircraft is flying faster than the speed of sound. As you see on the right, in this image, shock waves travel away from the vehicle. That's what the darker lines are meant to represent. Here, I can bring up my laser pointer. And so these shock waves, as they travel through the atmosphere, this is all very close to the aircraft, but as they travel through the atmosphere to the ground, they end up merging, and you get one shock wave at the front and one at the back, usually from conventional aircraft. And here this on the ground is a sonic boom. And for these traditional supersonic aircraft, you get just this bow and tail shock, and we call that an N wave signature because if you plot your pressure versus time, it kind of looks like the letter N. And those two shocks are what we hear as the sort of boom boom or bang bang sound of a sonic boom. You don't actually really hear the part in between. You just hear the shocks. There are some details that have to do with, how high is the overpressure and how long does it take for the pressure to rise to that peak, the rise time, and that changes your perception of it. A longer rise time means it's not as abrupt, so it's less annoying. And so a lot of the earlier shaping techniques and designs were meant to try to, play with this, reducing the pressure and increasing rise times to make things minimize those waves. So here's just an animation, if I can get it to come up, okay, of an aircraft flying supersonically over some community area. And what it's meant to illustrate is that the sonic boom is actually heard along quite a wide area that we call the sonic boom carpet. And here we're saying it could be 20 plus miles wide. It depends on the atmospheric conditions at the time. But so that it doesn't happen just under track, and it also doesn't just happen as the aircraft just gets to supersonic speeds. It happens along the entire supersonic route as it's flying above Mach 1. So that's something to keep in mind, because that means that potentially could be a lot of people who would hear this sound and be impacted by it. So that sonic boom carpet is kind of this gray area shown here. This is a cartoon showing the different areas of when you accelerate to supersonic speeds and the area on the ground that would be impacted, and then as you decrease speeds at the end and come down to landing. And there are different parts on this cartoon that are called out. I won't talk about each one of them, but just to say that NASA's been researching each one of these areas kind of in turn and making sure that we understand the physical phenomena and how to model it. And we've done a lot of measurements to validate our models to make sure that we kind of understand the big picture. But today I'm really only going to be talking about mostly the cruise portion of the signature, and what happens on the ground. So there are some unique aspects of sonic booms, which is why there's been a lot of research over the years, and then over the last about maybe 15 years, even more like renewed research. They're very short sounds. And so if you look on the top right for examples of pressure versus time, you see the time scale here. This is within a tenth of a second. It could be within a tenth or 2/10 of a second and the event is over. So it's very sudden and it could potentially be startling if it's loud enough. The red dashed line here is just kind of like a traditional N wave from something like the Concorde, and you see that it has that sharp N wave signature. It's kind of a high amplitude, but what we're talking about today is this blue line, the shaped boom that's less abrupt and much lower in amplitude. And then if you transition to looking at it in the frequency spectrum, so now we're looking at level versus frequency from 1 to 1,000 hertz. You see that the blue line, even though it still has low frequency energy, as you go higher in frequency, it drops off. And so this is where the human ear is more sensitive. And so this blue line would appear, much quieter than the red one overall. So, but there is still low frequency energy that can still elicit a response, especially if you're inside a building. You may feel vibrations or hear rattle and that sort of thing. So these are things that are a bit different from noise from subsonic aircraft. So that's why we've needed to come up with some new methods and metrics. We're also looking at the potential impact across the whole country as shown in this image here, as opposed to just interest in areas around airports. So it's kind of opposite problem as in subsonic aircraft noise. So I've talked about how we need some different methods or metrics to describe the sound. One of the metrics that has been used for many years is called perceived level. We call it PL. It's often used as a target when folks are doing their optimization on supersonic aircraft designs. They try to minimize the PL at the ground. It's a slightly complex metric in terms of being able to give a different spectral shape weighting for different noise levels. So louder noises have kind of a flatter frequency distribution, and softer noises more shaped. And this is basically better approximating how the human ear works. And it works well for explaining human response to outdoor booms. Doesn't work as well for indoor booms. It's a little bit more complex, and the low frequencies are a little bit more important when we're looking at indoor booms. So there have been other metrics that have been proposed that treat these low frequencies in different ways, and I'll get into a little bit of that later. So I already showed this slide, I think, but maybe the new information is here on the right, is that the design of the X59 is really meant to control the shock amplitudes and the positions so that you don't get that N wave at the ground, so the shocks don't merge. And then the cruise PL, perceived level, is 75 dB, and that's what we expect to get at the ground. This is under standard atmosphere conditions. Obviously, under real atmospheres, you'll have some variability about that. So just keep that number in mind as we look at some different data coming up soon. So now I'll talk about the psychoacoustics research, the simulators, the studies we've done in the simulators, and then going out into the field. So there are a lot of different simulators. The earliest ones were meant to simulate the outdoor environment, how you would hear the sound if you were outdoors. You can do set up your systems to reproduce these measured booms with the very low frequencies by using large subwoofers, as you can see in some of these pictures. Here's a simulator that still exists at NASA in the structural acoustics branch. So you see some large subwoofers, some smaller mid-range ones. You stick somebody in there and close the door on them, they might feel a little claustrophobic. But the sound field is as good as we can get it. There are similar um, simulator at JAXA. This is in Japan, and there was one at Lockheed Martin. I believe it's been dismantled. And so you can play back measured booms, but you can also play back booms of aircraft that don't exist, so just simulations. And you can filter them to try to approximate what it could sound like indoors, but that's a bit of an approximation. You obviously don't feel like you're in an indoor, home environment when you're in this little box, and you don't have the space and the reverberation and rattle, vibration, that sort of thing. So there are other things that you can do. You can also do some simulations over headphones. You can't just use any headphones. They do need to be high quality headphones or earphones that can reproduce at least the majority of the audible content of the booms and any kind of secondary rattle noises that you would expect to occur indoors. We've used binaural signals to try to approximate your experience of how you would feel if you were in a room, give that space, but it still is a bit of an approximation. There's no vibration. And so this is just kind of one step in the direction of being able to do indoor simulations. So then some other indoor simulators have become available in about the last 10 years. This is the booth I showed earlier in Japan. What they did is they added a panel inside where the sound then transmits from these speakers through this panel in the window to then where the subject would be sitting inside. So now they've introduced some kind of transmission to approximate what would happen if there was a boom that was impacting a building and transmitting indoors. It's still not as good as we would like it, but it was a step in the right direction and does create the right kind of levels that you would expect. So another configuration is what we built at NASA Langley, the interior effects room. And so this was finally operational maybe about 12 years ago now. I remember when I first started at NASA, it was half built. It was in process. So I was able to get in right at the beginning to be able to help out with tests in the simulator. And what we use are a couple of different walls of subwoofers. So there are 52 subwoofers and 52 mid-range speakers along these two walls. They create the sound that then transmits indoors, and this simulator is actually built with what we would consider typical American construction methods. And so the walls are typical to what a house would be. And so the sound transmits, real time into the interior of the simulator, and you get the levels that you would expect inside a home. And then you're in a much more comfortable environment, more living room like. I think it's a little bit neater than my own living room, a lot less stuff in the way. But we can also play back rattle noises that we can control, and we can also control vibration in the seating, and I'll talk about that later. And so that's a way that we can then study different parameters separately in a laboratory environment, but still having it feel a little bit more relaxed and comfortable and realistic for participants. So I said participants. This is what we do when we do psychoacoustic studies. We actually have to bring people into the lab to be our measurements. So we recruit participants from the surrounding community. We actually have a couple folks on site who do this recruiting for us, and they're great. They're able to get out into the community, find a diverse set of people in terms of age and gender. They also run hearing tests, and it depends on what we're doing in each lab test as to what hearing acuity we need. But usually it's just between needing to understand if the hearing is good enough at the low frequencies, which most people, the low frequency hearing is still pretty good, and being between, let's say, like 40 dB of the threshold of like a 20-year-old perfect hearing. And so most people can pass our hearing tests, and we've been able to get test subjects from all over. Sometimes we can get some college students to fill in some of the lower age brackets, but they need to be at least 18, need to be an adult in order to participate. We normally have about 30 to 40 participants at a time, and that's a pretty good number when you think about what we're trying to resolve in the laboratory study, trying to resolve differences of a certain number of dB or a different annoyance category. You get enough power in your statistics if you have about 30 to 40. If you go to 50 participants, it doesn't really help that much. You would have to go like a extra order of magnitude to like 300 for it to make much of a difference. So 30 to 40, and sometimes we recruit a little extra just in case somebody doesn't show up or doesn't pass a hearing test or something, that you have some extra people. We usually test them 2 to 3 at a time, and that's really due to the size of the facility and where we can place people to ensure that they're getting about the same sound field, because the sound does vary throughout the room. And we did a lot of tests when we first built this facility, and we actually rearranged our furniture several times until we got our positions where they were the most uniform, so that we were sure that the subjects were hearing essentially the same thing no matter where they were sitting. When we bring the test subjects in and they've done their hearing test, they fill out all the consent forms, etc., we actually have them just sit down and listen to a few of the sounds just so they become familiar. We don't usually tell them exactly what the sounds are. We don't say sonic boom, supersonic, or anything, but they know that they're aircraft sounds. So we just have them listen to the sounds so they understand, okay, this is what I'm going to be rating. Then we have them practice. And what we've been using the last several years are these little laptops. There's a little screen that comes up that's controlled from our control room, and it asks them a question, and they can click and select where they'd like their rating to be. And so we have them practice a few times and make sure they understand how to do it. And then we run the real test. And usually the real test is about an hour, but we give them breaks because people can get a little bored, honestly, and their concentration wanes. So we give them breaks, make them stand up, go for bathroom break, water, etc. And so shown here are just some example rating screens. We've run different kinds of tests, and depending on what you ask them to do, your analysis afterwards changes. But sometimes we ask them to do like an A/B comparison. You hear one sound, you hear a second sound, which one's more annoying? Check the box. Sometimes we ask them to just rate a sound on its own, just one in isolation. Where along the scale of annoyance, do you think that this sound fits? Is it not at all annoying, or extremely annoyed? Sometimes we've kind of left little dashed marks on the end of the this category line scale to see if people felt like they rated the last one at the top, but then they think this one's more annoying and they wanted a little bit more scale. So we tried that. It didn't really help out too much. Other times we don't ask specifically about annoyance. We've asked about other factors. This one's kind of a weird one, but we came up with a whole bunch of scales. This particular one is rate this from shallow to deep. And what it was kind of sounds with more low frequency energy would be closer to this deep. And it was a way to get test subjects to tell us how they felt about it without getting into technical jargon like low frequency energy, which people maybe wouldn't understand what we meant. And so we had a bunch of these different kinds of scales, and saw how folks answered those. So now I'll just talk kind of briefly, try not to get into all the, the gory details as much as I love this, about some of the tests that we've run. So one of our first tests, we just wanted to confirm that boom amplitude and the rise time I spoke about before, that those are still important factors for indoor booms. And the results confirmed our suspicions that yes, longer rise times of these low booms also result in a decreased annoyance. But we found when we were trying to look at different metrics, there was no one metric that worked better than the other. Several of them worked as well as PL, but none of them were perfect. So we said, okay, well now we need to conduct some more tests to figure out what would work better. If I move on to some of the more complex studies that we did a few years later, when we were talking about finally being able to build a demonstration aircraft like the X-59, this X-plane, we knew that it was going to have to be smaller than a full-scale airliner. For cost reasons, for one thing, but that smaller size and weight of this demonstrator, we knew is going to create a shorter sonic boom. It's going to have less low frequency energy than a commercial airliner. And we were, wondering, is 100 feet, is that enough? Is that going to be good enough for us to be able to translate the results from tests of a demonstrator to how people would respond to an airliner in the future? So we said, well, we can test this in the lab. So we got different sonic boom predictions, shape boom predictions from various partners for different size aircraft. So starting at this kind of demonstrator size, then we had a little bit larger business jet scale, then a small airliner, and then a larger airliner. We had 30 test subjects come, rate their annoyance to these different booms, and we found that as long as you are normalizing on the same PL values, so the same loudness, then annoyance to the demonstrator booms were not really very different than that for the full scale booms. And that's really what this plot is showing, that all the lines were very similar. There's too much scatter in the data for you to be able to say that one is different from the other. They're very close. And then we also confirmed that using the exterior loudness as opposed to the interior loudness that the people actually hear, you can use the exterior loudness for these kinds of correlations, and that'll help in the future when doing community studies, knowing that we can take measurements outside and not have to go into everybody's home to take measurements. And so this was a great result for us, helped justify plans for using a demonstrator in the future. The first time we did this, we did it just with booms alone, and then we did it again with booms and rattle sounds, which I'll get to in a moment. So we've looked at rattle and vibration effects separately in the lab. We've done the tests with the headphones, but then the tests in the IR in this configuration, you've already seen this picture. But for the vibration, we actually had to bring in this other furniture, it's this kind of funny looking Adirondack stool. And we needed this because we needed this kind of a chair in order to be able to isolate it from the natural vibration in the facility and then attach a shaker to the underside of the chair to actually create the vibration that the subjects would experience. And it was kind of funny because to me, this looked kind of obvious, but most test subjects who came in the room didn't even notice them, and they didn't know what was causing the vibration because they would ask us afterwards about it. So it wasn't as obvious as this. I think this is taken like from the floor looking up. In any case, we ran several studies with rattle and in vibration, and we found, the main results are really for the rattles, the large rattle sounds that you get from windows, walls, doors. Those things are much more annoying than things like wine glasses clinking and stuff like that. And it makes sense. That goes back to that shallow, deep scale I talked about earlier. And then in cases both for rattle and vibration, they both increase your indoor annoyance. And we came up with this, what we call a penalty, and saying that your annoyance when you hear the sound with rattle is just as annoying as having a boom that was 3 to 10 dB higher. And so that's what these penalties of 3 to 10 dB are. And so that's something to take into account. When you do other studies and you're only thinking about the boom sound itself, you have to remember that the rattle and vibration will add to that. So as we started doing all these tests, each time we looked at the metrics and we couldn't really figure out which metric worked better. It depended on the test, which one came out on top. And so we said, okay, what we really need to do is take a step back, do a meta-analysis, figure out which metrics overall might be the best. So we took different data sets from tests that we did here at NASA Langley, but then also in Japan at JAXA, and the studies that they had run in their simulator, and this included both the indoor and outdoor response. We went back and we actually tried to find like every metric imaginable, back to 70 metrics that we started evaluating with all these tests. And by the end, over a few years, as we added more and more tests, we ended up with 6 metrics that we recommended. And not one of them really outshone the others, but these 6 were better than all the rest of the 70. And so these 6 are listed here. You see all these that say SEL, that's sound exposure level, and then there's this like alphabet soup A, B, D, E, and that just has to do with the low frequency roll off and how sharp it really is, and the low frequencies and how much is included. Um, we found that PL was part of the winning group. These sound exposure levels, and then this last strange acronym ISBAP, was really our invention of combining PL with a couple of the other metrics as an extra like low frequency correction factor. And actually this A-weighted SEL didn't really work out very well in the meta-analysis, but we were asked to keep it for historical reasons because A-weighting is used historically for a lot of things, for other aircraft noise, even for like product noise, like you, I don't know, buy a vacuum cleaner and it tells you dBA, you know, how loud is this vacuum cleaner? And so that's something that people have a better intuitive feel for. So we've kept that along with the other 5. And so now we have 6 metrics and we'll continue to use those in analyzing future data, but we don't have to go back to all those other 70. So that's good. So the benefit of being able to do all these tests, these psychoacoustic studies in the lab, is that you can control your environment. You can test a variety of booms, aircraft that have flown, but aircraft that don't exist. You can study all the different factors separately, but obviously it's not as realistic as being in your own home. You can only study people's reactions to, you know, the sounds that they hear within that 1 hour block. And we essentially ask them usually to judge each sound on its own, or like I asked earlier, the A-B comparison. Whereas if you're at home, you can do some sort of community study, then you can study people's reactions over time. You know, how do you feel at the end of the day? How do you feel at the end of the week, at the end of a month, and that sort of thing. So that's really where we're going next, is what do we do to be able to actually gather people's perception of the sonic booms in their own homes, now that we kind of understand some of the basics and what metrics we should be using. So we started doing community response testing. Now we don't have this X-plane yet. None of these shaped boom aircraft exist, but we have our F-18 aircraft, and we've been able to come up with what we call a low boom dive maneuver, where we can approximate a lower amplitude boom at the ground in one small area by doing this dive maneuver. And it may not be shaped, but it's traveled through a large part of the atmosphere, and so it's had a lot of changes to it, and it kind of rounds out and becomes less loud by the time it gets to the area that you've planned. And so we've been able to use this a couple of times in 2 different community tests. Here I'm just calling out our most recent one in 2018, and this is all really to mitigate risks for the future X-59 testing. So we did this test, a lot of fun, in Galveston, Texas, in November. And on the right here is just a overhead map showing the Galveston island and some of the inner communities of, I would call, greater Galveston. And the idea was to test methods in a city where folks are not used to hearing sonic booms all the time. We had done a previous test in 2011 at Edwards Air Force Base, and they hear supersonic aircraft all the time from the Air Force Base there. So in this test, it was over a span of about 2 weeks. The participants heard about 4 to 8 sonic thumps, is what we called them, daily. So there were 52 in total. We recruited about 500 people to participate, and they filled out surveys. They had to fill out one at the beginning, just on background of how they feel of noise in their community, and you know, how is it to live in that community. And then we asked them to fill out a survey for each boom that they heard, so potentially up to 52, but nobody ever submitted surveys for all 52 because maybe they didn't hear them all. And then we also asked them to fill out surveys at the end of each day about their annoyance. And then we set up noise monitors throughout the community. That's what these yellow dots are showing, so that we could measure the sound levels in the survey area. And we tried to put them where, you know, essentially more of the people are, but being cognizant of staying away from loud things like highways and that sort of thing. We also did a lot of work on engaging the public and just communicating what we were doing. This is a big part of community testing, is being able to really upfront communicate with the public so that they understand what you're doing and why it's important, but not going so far as biasing their responses. So you don't want to say how wonderful it's going to be. You just have to say this is data that NASA needs to do whatever, and you have to kind of walk this fine line. And so this is all to help us figure out what are the right methods. In terms of the survey questions, they're a little bit different than what we used in the lab. It might be a little bit small, but this image here is just showing you like an example. Somebody on their smartphone, the survey will pop up after a boom, and it says, well, how much did the sonic boom bother, disturb, or annoy you? And answer on a scale of 0 to 10. And that's to help us be able to compare that to previous tests that have been done with aircraft noise. And so all of this then results in you're able to draw this curve of, okay, whatever your noise level is versus the annoyance in the community. And it generally takes this shape. If you kept going louder and louder, you would end up kind of plateauing at the top at a really high annoyance rate. But we're not testing up there. We're not interested in that. We already know really loud sounds are annoying. We're trying to understand more of the subtleties on the lower end. Where does this curve really start to pick up? And so this data is what we are planning to gather with X59. And then the idea is for NASA to gather this and then hand it over to the international regulators. The ICAO is the International Civil Aviation Organization. And then that regulatory body, along with FAA and all of its counterparts across the world, they're the ones who will decide, okay, what noise level should the limit be, and where does that end up on the percent of the population that you're annoying. They're the ones who make the decision. NASA provides the data. And so here's an actual dose response curve that we've measured from the 2011 test when we were out at Edwards. We looked at different statistical modeling techniques. It turns out, a lot of the work that had been done in the past, you have your data points of the people who are annoyed versus your noise level, and people just try to fit curves to them. But you see there's a lot of scatter in the data, and sometimes it's even worse than this. And depending on the number of people who respond to each level, it may not make sense to be trying to fit your curve to somewhere where you only had 2 people who answered that survey or something. So really we've come up with, or have been able to apply, I should say, more sophisticated statistical techniques to actually do a model of the community. And that's what's shown here. So these aren't really just curve fits. And they also, in some of these methods, account for correlation in responses that you get from the same participant, because we've recruited people and asked the same people to respond each time, so they're not like independent samples. And so we've come up with curves that look like what we expect, and so we're pretty happy about that. The methods seem to work. We repeated that for the 2018 study, and so now here, sorry, these are different colors, but that 2011 study I just showed you was in orange. Those are the circles, and then the more recent study are these green triangles, and they overlap. But in 2018, we didn't go as high in levels, so we don't have data beyond a certain point. But down here in the lower levels, they're very similar, and so we're kind of happy that yes, this makes sense. Things are looking good. We are figuring out what kind of statistical methods to use. But now this is just for the single events, how people respond to the survey after each boom sound. But we also wanted to look at how do people respond to the survey at the end of the day. And so those are shown here, those green triangles and orange dots, but then also compared to scatter, different colors and markers from other previous tests of other impulsive sounds. So some of them are sonic booms, but some of them are artillery, gunfire, and that sort of thing. And you see that actually what happens is we're in the ballpark, but we're testing at much lower levels now that there really isn't other data there to compare to. But at least in the areas where they overlap, we're in the ballpark of all this other data. Some of them are considered a bit like outliers, like these pink triangles, as potentially, a community that is just much more sensitive. And that can happen. Some communities just are more sensitive than others, which is why we are planning to test also at various locations across the US and not just one. So that's all kind of background leading to us. Where are we? What are we doing with this X59? What is the X59? I showed you a picture earlier and talked a bit about the shape, and really it's all about creating this low-shaped boom. That's what this is meant to demonstrate. It doesn't carry passengers. It just has one pilot, one lucky pilot who gets to fly on this. Obviously, to keep the costs within something that we could afford, we have been able to use some existing hardware, such as existing canopy for the cockpit, seat, crew escape, also an existing engine. We didn't do like a new engine design. Um, there are other things that were used to try to control this the stability of the aircraft and keep the cost down by doing some conventional arrangements here. A bit more about where we are today with it. The Lockheed Martin Skunk Works is building it. On the right is one of our most recent pictures. They actually have kind of the full aircraft shape now with the nose. I think that was one of the last pieces. They've done a lot of work on the wings themselves, and so they're making progress so that we would have our first flight next year. Obviously, there have been some impacts due to COVID, some things that have slowed down due to that, and so we're dealing with that. As I talked about before, the GE existing engine, but we've also had custom pieces designed and built specifically for this aircraft, and then some of the other like donor aircraft parts. So things are looking up. This is just kind of taking a step back and trying to show, well, what does a PL of 75 dB even mean? When I talked about that earlier, what does that mean to me? And so we came up with this scale of how loud is the X59? What is 75 dB compared to other impulsive sounds? If you start at the really high end, you could think of things like gunshots are much louder. As you come down in numbers, you make it down to 75 dB, where the X59 is predicted to be and designed for, and that's more equivalent to something like a car door slam at a neighbor's house or distant thunder. And so it's really down at that low level of what we're talking about, which is why we're at that bottom part of that curve that I was showing earlier, where it's a bit more subtle as to how many people are you annoying, maybe less than 5% of the population, but that's still to be confirmed with our X59 tests. And so I don't want to talk through all of these because I know probably kind of running out of time. I want to keep going. But basically, to tell you, we are planning for this community testing to start in 2024 and doing multiple campaigns across the US. And that'll include doing measurements like we did in Galveston, and then surveying the public. And so where we are today with that is just putting all the pieces together, planning, figuring out what are all the approvals that we need to go through in order to even fly a test. What do we need to refine in terms of our surveys, or how we're going to measure, estimate the boom sounds? How do we find people, geolocate them within the community so that we know what sound that they heard, and then further refining our statistical models to draw that dose response curve. And maybe I'll just mention real quick, we did award a contract to HMMH several months back, and that's really to kind of augment our team and allow us to be able to handle something of this magnitude. This is quite a large effort on NASA's side, and we didn't have all the internal workforce and resources to do it. So we've contracted with them, and they've got a great team from different subcontractors with different expertise to lend to this. So one of the main things with doing this community test is I talked about how different communities could have different sensitivities. We're trying to test across as many communities as possible, but it turns out costs dictate 5. We'll be able to do 5 communities, and we need to be able to choose them and to recruit our subjects so that as much as we can, the sample of the data will be nationally representative. So we need to make sure that we have diversity in the recruitment and in the site selection. And then also in, how you actually, I guess, analyze your data. And a lot of what we're doing is also kind of has to be done quickly. We only have a few years to do all these 5 tests. And so we need to make sure that we have automated ways of processing the data, making sure that we have good, high quality data quickly and run the analyses and be able to provide that data to the IKO so that they can do their rulemaking. So we are planning to do some more kind of small scale studies leading up to the big X59 community tests coming soon. And same thing with actually trying to estimate the booms that people hear. We won't be able to have a noise monitor right next to each person where they are as they move about their day. So we're going to set up about 150 noise monitors in the community and use those with predictions to fill in, where folks are and what they've heard. And there are different ways to combine this measurement and prediction data and then doing it in an automated fashion. And then also accounting for background noise that you're sure to get in a community. We saw that in Galveston, cars drive by, people run their lawnmowers, and that sort of thing. And so we also have some ways of testing this out before the big deal comes. So I talked
Excuse
about
me,
site selection. Yeah.
Alexandra. Yeah, we're
Yes.
getting close to the time that we have to wrap up.
Yeah, that sounds great. And I'll just finish here and just say, with the site selection, we're working on it. We are, we have different criteria that we're considering, and we have not chosen the sites yet, except for the first one that will be conducted out of NASA Armstrong. And so we're looking forward to that. And this is my last slide. So thanks so much for your time, and I'm happy to answer any questions in whatever remaining time we have. Thanks.
Oh, that's fine. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed it, but of course, I've got a lot of background in the area. I have 3 questions. The first one came from Manjula, and she asks, what are the goals of NASA collaboration with commercial companies, Ariane, Virgin Galactic, and Hermes? I never heard of that. And the plans for the next few years for supersonic flight. I think you already answered the last part, but is NASA collaborating with industry at all?
Yes, certainly at a higher level. So at the regulatory level within the IKO, NASA actually is involved in that standard setting process, and those industry partners are also involved in that standard setting process. And so in that framework, we're definitely working together to ensure that the standards are, economically feasible, but technologically realizable, and still do not present a problem for the public. So we're certainly working together in that framework. There are also some other, I guess I would say, collaborations that may be in the works that I may not be as aware of as others, up the program management chain. But we certainly want to be able to help all of industry, move forward with this. And beyond sonic boom, there are other other issues being worked, such as like emissions and landing and takeoff noise and that sort of thing. But in general, the partnerships that I'm involved in are more from research organizations, like I talked about JAXA. There's sort of like a NASA in Japan. There's ONERA, which is a similar research organization in France, and that sort of thing. So we tend to work with our counterparts more than directly industry, but that's still going on as well.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, thank you. Dick Yushin asks, and this is an interesting question, when you do the interior effects room test, do you have any background sounds like a radio, or are they watching television at all?
Yeah, yeah, we've talked about that quite a bit. In the end, we wanted to just have a quiet environment because we were just trying to look at these subtle differences. So what we ended up doing is the IR was too quiet. It was eerily quiet. So we actually did put a noise generator in the closet and put it at a level that was more like what you would expect in your house. You can hear the air conditioning or you can hear the refrigerator and things like that. But it was really just kind of this background white noise just to make it feel more realistic. And people even mentioned that's like, oh, I can hear the air conditioner. I'm like, no, you can't. That's the thing in the closet. But we did not test with any other specific noises because we thought, well, when we go to the community test, that's when it will be more realistic.
Yeah, yeah. And well, another interesting aspect about this question is if you're watching a show or listening to a particular piece of music or opera and right at a nice point, you get this interruption, kaboom. And that's another psychological contribution to annoyance, maybe. But anyway, let me go on to the next question. Damodar asks, when you are selecting your 30-member sample, do you pick them arbitrarily or do you look at other characteristics from psychology or biology to pick people that might have different sensitivities?
Yeah, when we do the laboratory studies, we don't delve too deep into that, but we just make sure that we have a range of ages, 18 and up, and that we have about half and half women and men. Sometimes it's more like 1/3, 2/3, depending on who's available. We don't delve too deep because, in general, most of those like demographic factors have been found to not really be that important to annoyance to noise. So when we do the lab studies, we don't worry about that too much. But when we go to the community studies, we do collect a lot of the kind of demographic information in that initial background survey. And that will help us in the end determine if we feel like we've hit what are the proportions that you have that are maybe collected like by the census. And if we don't hit those proportions, potentially there's a way to weight your data to match that better. But that's something that it's commonly done in community tests, even though everybody always has said based on previous tests that a lot of these other factors maybe don't change your annoyance. But one of the questions we do ask that we think does make a difference and it's hard to measure is just asking people to self-assess how sensitive are you to noise. Some people just are more sensitive. There's no reason that you can measure necessarily, they just are. And if they mark that on our background survey, we may be able to use that in our analyses to see if that makes a difference.
All right. One final question, this one from Olaf Storrisley. Is your research unique? In other words, is anybody else in the world building an SST to test people's responses to boom?
Yeah, at the moment, nobody else is doing this. For industry, they really can't afford to do a big research project like this. And so NASA is really the one who is trying to collect the data for everybody. Now, that doesn't mean there's nothing in the works. I know that there are folks who are interested in Europe and doing something similar, but they don't have the research funds. One potential thing that could happen is, as I mentioned in this top bullet here, is that we are interested in engaging with other countries, and there's a potential for flying the same X-59 but in another country and doing a survey in another country if we can find a partner who could actually foot the bill and work with us. But yeah, other than that, it's pretty unique. The industry that is developing supersonic aircraft right now are not necessarily low boom, they're more for over water routes.
So maybe in 2 years, then we can have you back with some results, you think?
It might have to be 3 years.
Oh, boy. Okay, this has taken a while. Well, thank you very much. I enjoyed your talk, and I'm sure a lot of the other folks did as well, and getting exposed to psychoacoustic testing. I'll think we turn this now over to Damodar.
Great. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you, Alexandra, for sharing with us all that information. I believe between the presentations given earlier by Dominique and David Richwine and now you, we got quite a bit, on the X-59, so we thank you for that.